There are three things that most people know about Turkish football: Besiktas, Galatasaray, and Fenerbahce. Between them, they have won a total of 213 trophies, including all but 8 Turkish Super League titles since the Super League's creation in 1959, and they are the league's only founding members never to have tasted relegation. This season, however, Fenerbahce are in third, a massive 15 points behind league leaders Trabzonspor. Reigning champions Besiktas are in 8th, set to miss out on qualifying for a European competition for the first time in a decade, and Turkey's most successful football club, Galatasaray, are currently enduring their worst ever campaign, closer to relegation in terms of both league standing and points won than they are to the top of the division, down in 13th place. The decline of Turkish football's three superpowers has been reflected in Turkish football's greatly diminished standing within the European game. There was a time when clubs across Europe, and certainly those here in England, would dread being pitted against Turkish opposition. A trip to Istanbul where you would be welcomed with a cauldron of animosity, rage, and intimidation, lit up by 1,000 pyrotechnics, was enough to make many players and teams crumble. That hostility and fervour certainly still exists. In fact, if anything, it has been solidified and antagonised by recent events, creating a powder keg that is just about ready to explode. But on the pitch, Turkish teams are no longer feared. In a country which has a larger population than Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, and a passion for football which can rival any other on the planet, this ought to be a scandal. Except, it isn't a scandal. It's several scandals, maybe even hundreds, roughly one new one a week at this moment in time. Election scandals, corruption scandals, and a series of conspiracies that even QAnon activists might say, well, hold on a minute there, call me old-fashioned, but this all seems a bit far-fetched to me. All piled one on top of the other, as teams and club presidents have become locked in a vicious war of words, often forgetting about the small business of actually running a football club. The Turkish Super League has become so wild that, over the last couple of months, I have been working on documentaries about 4 different Super League teams, having already made one about Istanbul Başakşehir. I still plan on making those 4 videos at some point in the future for a more in-depth look at their specific circumstances. But I decided that the league as a whole, as it teeters on the verge of bankruptcy and descends further and further into a state of absolute madness, was deserving of a video all of its own. So sit back, relax, and join me on a journey to a transcontinental country, 97% of which lies in Asia, but which competes within UEFA. To a land where empires have risen and fallen for thousands of years, as Turkey's footballing institutions appear to have been conquered not by external forces, despite their protestations, but by their own reckless incompetence. The Turkish Super League, and the country's big three in particular, have been chronically mismanaged for more than a decade. There is a sense in Turkey that the country's football clubs are being run more like football Twitter accounts than by professional administrators and directors. The big three in Turkey are all member-owned, which means that roughly once every 3 years, members get the chance to elect a new club president, and in recent years, they have tended to do just that. Fenerbahce elected a new president in 2018, Besiktas in 2019, and Galatasaray in 2021. To get elected, presidential candidates make pledges and devise bold, exciting slogans which they hope supporters will rally around and therefore get them elected. However, since their presidential terms are so short and the appetite for success among supporters is so fervent, these promises tend to be very short-term goals and ambitions. What's more, only narrowly defeated and future presidential candidates will often cast a critical eye over every move the club makes, meaning that every poor result and every perceived mistake is heavily scrutinised. In recent years, the security of incumbent presidents has become even more fragile, leading to ever more erratic behaviour. There is almost no length that teams and presidents won't go to in recent years in order to avoid scrutiny, which includes blaming just about everyone else other than themselves for their team's problems. That has given rise to a sort of Trumpian rhetoric within the Turkish game, if you like, as clubs look to divert blame away from their own mismanagement and onto just about any target they can think of, some of which have become increasingly conspiratorial. As anyone who follows Turkish football will know, there appears to be a new club statement shared on social media by one of the clubs just about every week, blaming either referees, the Turkish Football Federation, another club, or someone else for their recent plight. Just take Fenerbahce, who are surely the most conspiratorial Super League team of them all, having claimed over the last few years that just about everyone in Turkey, and indeed some people beyond, are out to get them. Last season, perhaps having run out of people to blame after 7 seasons without a Super League title, and having slipped to a 7th place finish in the Super League the previous season, which was their worst showing since the 1980s, Fenerbahce became embroiled in a bitter spat with the Super League's broadcasters, beIN Sports. The club accused the Qatari state-owned channel of treating Fenerbahce unfairly, claiming that the broadcaster had manipulated VAR decisions against them, that they had removed positive phases of play by Fenerbahce from their highlights reels, and that they had instructed their own commentators to criticise Fenerbahce players. Fenerbahce president Ali Koç wrote on the club's website that the summaries, the lines drawn, and the slow motion positions shown were an issue that Fenerbahce can no longer accept. beIN pointed out that they have no influence over VAR decisions and that the camera angles that officials see are provided by the league's official feed, not by the television feed. But that didn't satisfy Koç, who also claimed that Fenerbahce were receiving less money from beIN than their rivals. beIN also had a pretty straightforward response to that allegation, explaining that their broadcast deal was with the Super League and not with individual clubs, and that they simply pay the league their broadcasting fees, which goes into a central pot before that cash gets redistributed by the league themselves, not by the broadcasters. Last season, when all football was played behind closed doors, beIN's coverage of the Super League, much like football coverage across the globe, gave viewers the choice of watching the game with or without artificial crowd noise being pumped in. The dispute between Fenerbahce and beIN wasn't exactly helped when beIN's crowd noise, inadvertently, according to the broadcasters, was found to include a derogatory chant about Fenerbahce supporters. An internal investigation by the company led to 2 people losing their jobs over that, and when beIN published an apology to the club on their Instagram account, a whole new argument was inflamed. beIN's public apology on social media was posted at 7:05 PM local time, or 19:05 as per a 24-hour clock, which Fenerbahce considered to be a deliberate slight against them because their rivals Galatasaray were founded in the year 1905. No, I am being deadly serious. The feud between Fenerbahce and beIN came to a head a little over a year ago when Fenerbahce players started warming up for games wearing tops with a mocked-up beIN logo which instead read, "Be fair." Fenerbahce also plastered that message around their stadium and onto 3D carpets on the grass, which made it highly visible during beIN's broadcasts of Fenerbahce games. beIN said that they were willing to broadcast criticisms of their coverage, but not the logo, which they claimed violated the company's intellectual property. Fenerbahce's latest conspiracy didn't just enrage beIN, who took the club to court and won an injunction which stopped them from being able to use the logo in March 2021, but also every other Super League team, who saw Fenerbahce's criticisms of beIN as threatening the league's deal with beIN, which was worth $500 million to the league. It must be said that Fenerbahce's president, Ali Koç, who was elected in 2018, is a third-generation member of the Koç family, making him one of the richest people in Turkey, which is, in large part, why he was elected. Koç was educated at Harrow School in London, the 3rd most expensive boarding school in all of England, and he got his MBA from Harvard Business School during the mid-1990s. Before joining the family enterprise, Koch worked for American Express and Morgan Stanley, as well as being a long-standing board member at Fenerbahce before being elected president of the club. He isn't an idiot, is what I'm trying to get at. We can say with some degree of certainty, therefore, that he knows full well that most of the claims that he makes, whether they are about beIN or anyone else for that matter, are completely baseless. But it's much easier to say the whole world is against us than it is to admit that you're not playing very well, you're racking up debt, and you haven't won a trophy in 7 years. The problem is, and it should be said that Fenerbahce are certainly not alone on this front, though they are perhaps the worst offenders, by ratcheting up the pressure, whipping your most unhinged supporters up into a frenzy, and embellishing the most deranged conspiracy theories flying around on the internet. Club presidents are creating the perfect storm for something really sinister and dangerous to happen. Since 2009, there have been increased instances of violence between Turkish football fans. In May 2013, Burak Yildirim, a 19-year-old student, was stabbed to death on the day of the Istanbul derby for the crime of wearing a Fenerbahce shirt. 7 months later, midfielder Manuel Fernandes was kicked to the ground whilst playing for Besiktas. Not long after that, Burak Yilmaz was struck in the face with a pocket knife whilst playing for Galatasaray. The list goes on, and Fenerbahce ought to be as conscious of those dangers as anyone else. In 2015, their team bus was shot at by assailants armed with shotguns. The driver of Fener's team bus suffered serious face injuries but managed to keep control of the vehicle. Had he not been able to do so, the bus most likely would have veered off the edge of a cliff, killing all 42 players and staff on board. The metaphor, in this instance, is all too real. And yet, as Fenerbahce continued to ramp up the rhetoric against people like Hande Summertash, who worked as a media coordinator at Galatasaray before getting a job at beIN as a director of their media rights in 2020, there seems to be little thought given to the consequences. Fenerbahce considered Summertash's appointment as further evidence of beIN's deep-rooted bias against them, which led to her receiving a whole torrent of threats and abuse. On Beyaz Football TV, a former referee described Summertash as a plump and brainless lady before stating, "I will hurt you." Summertash switched roles in January after only 18 months in the job, becoming a creative and comms director at Digiturk instead. Whilst these increased instances of threats and indeed actual violence is most worrying for very obvious reasons, it is also damaging to the Super League team's bottom lines. When football stadiums are deemed to be unsafe, fewer fans will go. In the 2008-09 season, the Super League average attendance was close to 15,000. By 2013-14, the average had fallen to below 10,000, and this season, the number stands at just 7,433. That has obvious financial implications for Super League teams, and it is at this point that it's probably worth talking a little bit about the insane economics of Turkish football. Almost every Super League team is in debt, and in a lot of it. The Big Four in Turkey, as they are sometimes referred to, made up of the traditional Big Three plus Trabzonspor, are in around $2 billion worth of debt. That is up 600% in the space of 10 years. Fenerbahce topped the list in over $700 million of debt at the last count, followed by Besiktas and Galatasaray, with the current league leaders, Trabzonspor, some way behind. Super League teams have long spent money that they don't have on aging superstars whose impacts on the pitch often haven't been able to keep pace with their enormous salaries. Signings like Alvaro Negredo and Gary Medel at Besiktas, Lucas Podolski and Nigel de Jong at Galatasaray, and Nani and Roberto Soldado at Fenerbahce. Going back even further than that, you have the likes of Didier Drogba, Roberto Carlos, and Guti. Some, such as Bafétimbi Gomis and Wesley Sneijder, have actually made a real impact. But the reality, which Turkey's Big Three in particular seem unwilling to accept, is that they simply cannot afford them. The Turkish Super League is ranked 20th in UEFA's league coefficients, sandwiched nicely between the Croatian First League and the Cypriot First Division. That is, a damning indictment of Turkish football in of itself, given the fact that Cyprus has a population of just 1.2 million people, and around 300,000 of them live in the Turkish-controlled, disputed and unrecognised state of northern Cyprus, but it is also notable because you don't see those leagues, or even those ranked above them like the Swiss Super League or the Belgian Pro League, signing players on anything like the wages that Fenerbahce will have paid to sign Mesut Ozil in 2021. Of course, there is more money in Turkish football. Teams have much larger fan bases than those in Croatia, Cyprus, Switzerland or Belgium, with several wealthy benefactors. Fenerbahce, for example, not only have the wealth of the Koç family behind them, worth an estimated $8 billion, but they are also aided by media mogul and multi-millionaire supporter Acun Ilıcalı, who recently bought Hull City, and indeed the Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, who is often thought to have lent a very lenient and supportive hand from his position of considerable authority towards his favourite club. Hence why rival supporters find Fenerbahce's claims of institutional bias against them to be so absurd. Even with those extenuating circumstances, though, Turkish football clubs are writing cheques that they are unable to cash. For years now, Fenerbahce have been asking their own supporters to help fund the club by sending a text to the club with the message Fener OL, which will send them a small donation. Ostensibly, the campaign seemed to be devised with the primary goal of paying the club's extortionate debt down. But in 2021, Fenerbahce signed Mesut Ozil, the Turkish Super League's biggest signing in years, and they briefly updated their campaign to ask supporters to text the code Mesut OL. Though it was never stated outright, the implication seemed to be that supporters were being asked to cough up to cover Ozil's wages. During Ozil's debut campaign, Fenerbahce's accounts appeared to suggest that Ozil wasn't even taking a salary, and some people suggested that the new Hull City owner Acun Ilıcalı might have been paying him himself, with Sky Sports reporting that, quote, the club will be helped by part of Ozil's overall income agreement being funded by the Istanbul-based XN Media Group, which, in return, will retain some of his image rights. Ilıcalı is a friend of Ozil's, and he certainly aided his move to Istanbul, widely reported as having been involved in the negotiations with Arsenal throughout. Now that Ozil's time at Fenerbahce, the club that he grew up supporting, has turned sour, he is being widely linked with a move to Hull City due to the links with Ilıcalı. I should think that it is rather unlikely, by virtue of both his wages and his potential reluctance to relocate to East Yorkshire, though stranger things have certainly happened at the club that many of you will know that I support. These types of signings, the Mesut Ozils of this world, ought to be the first casualty of the Super League's debt crisis and subsequent cost-cutting measures. Galatasaray's unsuccessful signing of Radamel Falcao, who spent most of his 2 years in Istanbul out injured and supposedly cost the club a whopping €25 million, and Mesut Ozil's marquee move to Fenerbahce, which didn't take long to fall apart, with the player and club currently in contract termination talks, some analysts believe, are part of a dying breed, and may have been the last two signings of their kind on that scale at least. Nick Miller wrote in The Athletic last month that, quote, the lavish statement signings are no longer worth the risk, end quote. He's right. Logically, they are not. But Turkish football is not operated by means of ordinary logic. I mentioned at the start of this video the sentiment among some that Turkish football is being run by Turkish football Twitter. And though that might seem like a bit of a silly statement to make, underestimate the extent to which it is true at your peril. And it is exactly those types of signings, the Ozils and Falcaos of this world, that excite fans and get them typing away at their keyboards, get the come to Besiktas hashtags trending, and distract from more structural issues at clubs that presidents refuse to tackle. The extent of the debt crisis among Turkish Super League clubs is such that, recently, the central government actually had to step in, along with the help of 4 major Turkish banks, to restructure that debt and create a repayment program. Turkish football clubs now have 2 years of reprieve to get their houses in order and to ensure that they are able to start paying down their debts, since they simply would not be able to start paying them down now, and then they will have 9 years of regular repayments until the debt is cleared. Turkish football clubs aren't alone in having amassed enormous amounts of debt. FC Barcelona are up to their eyeballs in debt, having to have debt restructuring and repayment programs all of their own, redrafted virtually every season to stave off going bust. But Barcelona fans do at least have something to get excited about, with one of the most gifted and exciting young squads in all of world football. Tottenham, likewise, have more than £800 million in gross debt, but they do have something to show for it. Possibly the best stadium in all of Europe, which will become a money-making machine for the club, helping them to repay the long-term, low-interest loans that they took out to build it. Turkey's big three are saddled with enormous debt, have nothing like the revenue of Barcelona or Tottenham, and have nothing to show for it. Worse still, during the period in which they have amassed this debt, Turkish football has declined significantly. 9 years ago, the Turkish Super League ranked 10th in UEFA's coefficients. Now it ranks 20th. No Turkish team has reached the knockout stage of the Champions League since the 2017-18 season. Besiktas lost all 6 group games this season, with an incredible -16 goal difference. Similarly, Istanbul Başakşehir lost 5 of their 6 group games last season, finishing bottom of their group with a -11 goal difference, and it was a similar story for Galatasaray, who finished bottom of their group with only 2 points to their name in the season before that. Things don't get much better when you take a look at the Europa League, despite Galatasaray's decent showing this season, where a Turkish team hasn't got beyond the round of 16 stage since Besiktas managed to do it in 2016-17, 5 years ago. Not only has the mismanagement of Turkey's big three seen them lose ground on their European peers though, they now don't even seem capable of winning their own league. All three have had bad seasons in the past, but never all in the same season before. Galatasaray look to have been the hardest hit at this moment in time, currently 13th in the Super League, on course for their worst ever campaign. Galatasaray are the most successful football club in Turkey, the only Turkish team to win a major trophy in Europe, and they have finished in the Super League's top 3 in 51 out of the past 65 seasons. The lowest the club has ever finished is 11th place, over 40 years ago, and last season they finished just a point behind eventual title winners Besiktas. Now they are 30 points behind the current league leaders Trabzonspor, and the club is in chaos. The loss of Gedson Fernandes, who made a big impact on loan from Benfica last season, has certainly been felt, but as with Besiktas and Fenerbahce, Galatasaray's problems are deep-rooted and structural. Club president Burak Elmas was elected with a majority of just 41 votes in June 2021, with one of his landmark policies being to keep club legend Fatih Terim on as head coach, at least until his 3-year contract with the club expired. In January, following a dreadful run of form, Elmas sacked Terim. Many Galatasaray fans feel that he had no other choice but to do so, whilst others were angered at Terim's treatment, especially after it emerged that Elmas had been in contact with his replacement, Dominic Torrent, who previously served as Pep Guardiola's assistant at Barcelona, much earlier than he originally cared to admit. Even if you take the view that Elmas was right to sack Terim and had no other choice, on the grounds that Galatasaray had to modernise and that the club's old methods just weren't working, that is essentially the argument that was made by many of his rival presidential candidates in the last election, which he so narrowly won, arguing for something quite different. There are now calls among some Galatasaray fans for Terim to actually run for the club's presidency, but as popular as that may be, the 68-year-old reportedly isn't yet ready to swap coaching for administration. There is an argument that some have made that Galatasaray's demise has been so sudden and so severe, from runners-up last season to relegation candidates at Christmas, that they may have taken reform the most seriously of the big three, and have taken a genuine change of tact. The proof of the pudding will be in the eating as to whether that is really the case, and some people are much more cynical about the whole league. In addition to all of the issues that I've raised up to this point, Turkish football also had a massive match-fixing scandal in 2011, which appeared to be rather clumsily swept under the rug. Accusations of corruption and compromised officials have persisted ever since, leaving some to become disillusioned with the league. More Turkish football fans than ever before have started to tune into games from other countries, such as the Premier League, than the Super League for the first time, due to the quality of football and, perhaps even more importantly, the actual focus on football rather than 101 other issues off the pitch. There are also those who feel that the presidents and directors of Turkey's biggest football clubs are not remotely serious about reform. Galatasaray, Besiktas, and Fenerbahce are footballing institutions more so than they are mere football clubs. And there is a general consensus in Turkey that they are simply too big and too culturally important for the Turkish government to ever allow for them to fail. The recent debt restructuring can be viewed within this context, and there is certainly good reason to believe that the government will always step in to prevent the big three from going to the wall. Just because they may be safeguarded from extinction, though, does not mean that they are insulated against the threat of terminal decline. There is a genuine danger, if not a likelihood at this stage, that Turkish football is looking at not just another lost generation, but a permanent realignment, whereby the Super League is comparable to the top flights in Cyprus and in Bulgaria in terms of talent and professionalism, more so than it is comparable to the top flights in Belgium or the Netherlands. If you take a look at those two leagues specifically, the Belgian Pro League and the Eredivisie, whose teams have enjoyed greater success and prosperity than Turkish teams over the past decade, one thing that unites them and distinguishes them from the Super League at least, has been their ability to churn out talented young players, and/or to sign them and then sell them on for significant profit. There are a handful of examples of that happening in the Super League, but they are isolated examples, not even remotely comparable to the output of Ajax on their own, let alone Dutch and Belgian teams more broadly. Given Turkey's population and the country's passion for football, there can be little doubt that it should be a football powerhouse. But there is so little interest and investment when it comes to youth development. Young kids in Turkey are often football mad, but lack access to a decent pitch or coaching. There are likely to be countless potential world-class Turkish youngsters that have just been allowed to slip through the net as a consequence. The Super League is among the oldest leagues in Europe in terms of their players' average ages. And it is perhaps telling that Turkey's national team captain, Hakan Çalhanoğlu, was born and received his footballing education in Germany. Meanwhile, arguably the country's standout young player, Orkun Kukçu, was born and raised in the Netherlands and is a graduate of the Feyenoord youth ranks. I have painted a pretty bleak picture of Turkish football in this video, particularly for the so-called Big Three, and for good reason. And to compound all of their problems, the fears around Fenerbahce's bitter battle with beIN Sport that went all the way to the courts appears to have come home to roost. The Super League's television rights, once worth $500 million, now appear to be valued at just a fraction of that. When beIN's offer of $142.63 million for all 8 packages of the Super League's TV rights was turned down last month, they pulled out of negotiations. Saran Media have now agreed a deal for the rights to 5 out of the 8 packages at a greatly reduced price to what they would have been worth in previous seasons, though that doesn't include the most valuable package, named 1A, which includes all of the biggest games between the Big Three and remains unsold. All this means that Super League teams will be attempting to pay down their enormous debts over the next decade with, at least for the foreseeable future, significantly reduced income. A bizarre advantage for Super League teams in terms of paying down that debt has been the 2018 to 2022 Turkish currency crisis, which has seen huge inflation in the country and the Turkish lira depreciate significantly in value. Since the debts of Turkish football clubs are held with Turkish banks in Turkish lira, it means that the amount that they owe, in relative terms, has decreased. Of course, they are not immune from the damages of Turkey's broader economic crisis, which has drastically reduced their purchasing power when buying players or trying to sign them across the continent. That broader context of economic crises, political dissatisfaction, and the cycle of misinformation, none of which is unique to Turkey at this moment in time, it should be said, though it is perhaps even more pronounced there, cannot be removed from the context with which all of these footballing issues are viewed. Turkish discourse has become more conspiratorial, and so too has Turkish football. Turkey's currency has been devalued, and it faces a significant debt crisis, whilst Turkish football has seen its international standing greatly diminished and faces a debt crisis. The people in charge of Turkish football are stubborn, deceptive, and will blame anyone else for their problems other than themselves, and, well, we'll just leave the parallels there, shall we? I don't want to get this video banned in Turkey like my Istanbul Başakşehir one was, or so I have been told by a number of Turkish subscribers. That is it for today's video. Thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. I hope that was the case. Let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on for HITC Sevens. You can also find me on social media via the username HITC Sevens on both Twitter and Instagram.